Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, HITRUST Success, What You Need to Know, hosted by Ostendio and Cherry Baker. HITRUST certification is growing in popularity, yet there are still many unanswered questions about the certification process. Today we are going to tackle HITRUST compliance, and we will also answer your live questions at the end of the webinar. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone of a couple of housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent out at the end of the webinar. Attendees are in listen-only mode, but please feel free to submit your questions via the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And now on to our two presenters. Grant, can you please present yourself?
Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Grant Elliott. I'm the President and CEO of Ostendio. I'm also actually the president of the Healthcare Cloud Coalition, and I'm really happy to be here today to spend a little bit of time about talking about HITRUST, which is obviously a framework that we spend a lot of time working with. Let me hand it over to Steve to introduce himself.
Good day, everybody. My name is Steve Usillo, and I'm a partner with Cherry Becker, and I'm also the National Leader of Information Assurance and Cybersecurity. Basically, my areas of expertise fall in all things cybersecurity and InfoSec related, SOC 1, 2, and 3, HIPAA and HITRUST, HIPAA security. We also get involved in ethical hacking and vulnerability management, also incident response and other elements of security compliance frameworks. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I certainly look forward to sharing with everybody today.
Thank you, Steve. So why don't we get started with just a basic overview of HITRUST. Hopefully most people who have joined at least a high-level knowledge of HITRUST. But in essence, HITRUST is based on a common security framework that was developed back in 2007. The framework has gone through numerous releases. It's now about to launch its ninth major release and update as it continues to add alignment with other major standards and regulations. The initial objective of HITRUST was to try and create a comprehensive set of healthcare best practices. While many other standards and frameworks existed, there was a lack of consistency across some of them, and also a lack of enforcement or standards. That there continues to be within things like HIPAA regulations a lot of flexibility in interpretation that allows people to implement at different levels. And so the attempt of HITRUST was to try and create a common perspective or a common understanding to make sure that everyone would basically be working from the same framework. It originally based on ISO 27001, which is a European standard, originally a European standard until it became an international piece. HITRUST obviously has evolved, as we've mentioned, through those. Next slide, please. Adoption for HITRUST took a while, but is rapidly increasing. For large hospitals and health plans, particularly those with over 500,000 members, about 80% of those organizations have adopted the HITRUST framework. A number of major players came out a couple of years ago and specifically stated that in order to do business with them, you had to actually go through the HITRUST process and be HITRUST certified. So if you're currently a vendor today of a major healthcare organization, such as a payer or a provider, then there's a good chance that your customers are requiring you to go through this process. So it's something that's worth learning about. Next slide, please. So why was it? Let's go back to the original cause of why HITRUST was developed. We don't have to go very far from the news to see increasingly the number of breaches that are occurring. The healthcare industry has been the center for cyber threats for many, many years. And I think most people will accept that as an industry, healthcare has been a little bit behind the times compared to maybe, for example, retail or finance or some other specific industries. And that's, despite the fact that there's an increasing need and an increasing valuation of the data managed within the healthcare environment. So even going back to 2007, we were still seeing the emergence of IP orientated devices. And we've continued to see that evolve over the last 10 or so years with an increased digitization of information, as well as the mobility that's developed over that period of time. Everything from telehealth, medical devices, mobile medical applications, etc. So the objective really is, how do you understand and judge from a similar language in order to understand the risk involved in this, and how do you try and do that in a way that's cost effective? So by creating a standardized approach, the hope is that HITRUST provides a degree of consistency. So when two organizations are managing or measuring each other, they can have a good sense of what the measurement and the standard actually is. And the idea deliberately is to go above and beyond the requirements of HIPAA. HIPAA as a regulation, as I mentioned earlier on, it can be a little bit grey. And so the idea is to provide not just more clarity, but also, depending on the needs of the business and the organization, actually provide some requirements that might go above and beyond HIPAA security standards. Next slide, please. So, as we mentioned, HITRUST tries to build on top of HIPAA. One important thing to bear in mind is that HIPAA is a federal requirement, HITRUST is not, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But any organization that's in the situation where they're managing protected health information on behalf of a covered entity obviously has to be HIPAA compliant, either as a covered entity or a business associate. HITRUST basically allows for an organization to make sure that they're actually meeting that specific requirement, as well as going above and beyond it. And obviously, HITRUST is dependent on the healthcare industry itself, and so is limited for the most part to the healthcare industry. But again, HIPAA is the one that kind of defines the penalties and a lot of the regulations for security breaches, and HITRUST builds on top of that. A couple of other things just before we jump on. HITRUST is specific to each organization, so obviously start off, and Steve's going to take you through the process to do an independent assessment. The specific scoring, the number of protocols that you're measured against is going to be vary organization to organization, whereas HIPAA is much more generic, and whilst arguably the risk element of HIPAA can be tailored to an organization, obviously the regulations themselves apply to all organizations. And HIPAA is actually limited to healthcare data, as I mentioned earlier on, handled by covered entities, either as you're operating as a healthcare covered entity, or a clearinghouse, or a business associate. And finally, the HITRUST CSF certification, as we mentioned, is a much more rigorous level than a HIPAA audit. So typically you would find if someone's going through a HITRUST certification, you can be sure that they've put much more effort into meeting that certification, typically than you'd expect an organization who may have simply just done a HIPAA audit.
So Grant, thank you very much for that overview, which is going to lead us into the next phase of what we're going to discuss here, which is really around the Common Security Framework, or the CSF. The CSF is a tool used within HITRUST for both organizations and assessors in order to understand and identify the requirements that are required for validation or certification, which we'll talk to the difference of those a little later on. But it's important to note that HITRUST was originally predicated on ISO 27001, elements of NIST, and HIPAA security, but you can clearly see that there's a cross-pollination of other types of regulatory requirements and frameworks that are built into the engine to allow organizations to expand upon their risk management framework in order to custom tailor the best approach if they're reporting across different verticals. We typically see something like that would be an organization that is specific to healthcare delivery, but may also specialize in other forms of service delivery that can, again, expand above and beyond that. These requirements are very prescriptive. It is a framework, but the actual controls and the implementation requirements that you do get assigned once you go through the risk assessment process are very prescriptive. And again, they certainly are broadly applied across each of these different circles here for purposes of what these frameworks are. But the important thing to remember is that as an organization goes through this process, it's really not, one size fits all. It's basically a custom tailored approach based on the company's inherent risk profile. So one organization may not necessarily be the same as another based on these particular makeups. As of version 8, there's 14 control categories. 13 are security related and 1 is privacy related. There's 46 control objectives. Again, as of version 8, there's 149 controls over 19 domains. And each control has 3 different implementation levels. So if you're familiar with NIST 853 for much of what's required in the government security sectors, you'll understand that there's kind of 3 different implementation levels of a control based on the level of risk assigned, and that's low, moderate, and high. So HITRUST has adopted a risk management framework and a risk methodology very similar, where as you go through and start to measure up against these particular risk components, you could potentially be in 1, 2, or 3 levels within that control, and that's customizable. It's also cumulative. So if you're assigned a level 3, the expectation would be that you've covered levels 1 and level 2. Next slide, please. So HITRUST is very proactive in keeping their engine updated for new and emerging requirements and changes to regulatory requirements. And as you can see from the previous slide, being adopted in so many of these different areas, it's important to stay on top of all of the ever-changing threat landscapes and frameworks that actually try to mitigate these risks. So as of version 9, there's 75 core control statements that increase from version 8 from 66. And these are the core requirements for certification. So some of these new requirements are based on the following items here. FedRAMP being one, obviously for government sector. EHNAC, which is the Electronic Healthcare Network Accreditation Commission. The OCR, Office of Civil Rights Audit Protocol version 2, which is compliance with HIPAA security rule. And FFIEC, which is the Information System Examination Protocols, is another one that's actually covered in this as well. And the Department of Homeland Security's Critical Resilience Review. So as each of these versions start to address new and emerging standards, obviously it becomes even more comprehensive, and these changes are typically something that we like to keep our eye on. Version 9, I know one of the buzzwords around many of you that are in the privacy space, GDPR is all over the place and gaining more and more popularity. So version 9.1 is going to be looking, I think it's going to be released sometime this year, but it's looking to incorporate the EU regulation 2016/679, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, aka GDPR. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk high level about the HITRUST basic process. This process is we're going to actually walk through and step through each of these particular components here, but it's important to know that this process does highlight, I guess I would say, 4 critical risk management framework steps. Primarily, we're going to be identifying risk and defining the protection requirements in order to compensate and mitigate for those risk parameters. We're going to specify the relevant controls that are going to help us with that mitigation. We're going to implement and manage those controls, and then of course we're going to assess and report on those. So that's typically what you're going to see throughout this process here, but as stated earlier, we're going to step into each one of these. So let's step into the scope. Next slide, please. So this is probably one of the more important aspects of just about any type of compliance engagement that you get involved in, and that's really properly defining the scope. This can make or break an assessment. So a very proactive approach in defining the scope is highly recommended. I typically talk to clients and edge on the side of conservatism here to make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed as it pertains to what we're looking to cover. I've seen organizations step into this fairly aggressive, and I commend them for their efforts, but as you'll identify throughout this process, and I know Grant will be talking later, to get involved and to aggressively tackle this can be quite a burden. So in many cases, you want to define your scope properly, where you're obviously getting what you need to do to address all your service level requirements and expectations. both regulatorily and from your customers. But at the same token, you don't want to get overly aggressive where you're spending an abundance amount of resources in trying to deal with compliance that might be a little more mature than your organization is really ready to handle. So when you think about the scoping process, once you've identified your environments in the areas at which you want to bring into the assessment or into your self-assessment, there's going to be a process by which, when you subscribe to the CSF tool, that allows you to go through this and adequately scope your environment based on the risk metrics and the framework parameters that are defined within the tool. And these are factors, and there's a number of different types of, there's a few different areas that these consist over. There's regulatory factors, and these are federal, state, and domain-specific compliance requirements. And this, again, is going to vary depending on the organization, where they do business, how large they are, whether they're international, whether they're national, what state laws or data that they may reside within their system, so they store, process, or transmit, such as California law, Texas, Nevada, Mass. There's FSMA requirements, potentially PCI, FTC red flag, the list goes on. So there's a number of different regulatory factors that HITRUST tool, the CSF tool, is fairly comprehensive in identifying, and these all have an impact on how your assessment methodology is going to pan out. The other factors are inherent factors based on the organization itself. Again, these are geographic factors. An example would be maybe the number of records processed or held, the number of users, how many external connections they may have, how many interfaces to the system, so on and so forth. And this is a common type of risk methodology across a number of different industries. If any of you are familiar with the cyber risk assessment for the FFIEC or even amongst best practice NIST framework risk assessments, these are things that you typically take into consideration. And then you have system components as well, and that's where data stores. Again, those external connections that you may have, these are more technically related to the system itself and the number of users and transactions. So you have organization, and then you have system specific there. So I think the other aspects of this, as you get through the scoping process and you have this clear definition, many times I have customers will come back and ask questions about what's relevant and what's not. And as an assessor, I do provide the expertise that I have in my judgment there, but it's ultimately the organization's responsibility to understand and define that scope. It's their assessment, it's their environment. So I typically encourage organizations, once you've solicited what you need for purposes of identifying the scope, sometimes it's a great idea to bounce it off your legal team or other legal resources internally. So should, heaven forbid, right, that you have some type of a problem or a breach, you weren't missing the boat with some type of breach response notification based on the fact that you missed a particular regulatory requirement. Next slide, please. So another part of the scoping process is really trying to understand what is it here that we want to accomplish, right? So the scoping process allows you to take a couple of different assessment approaches. You can do what's called a CSF security assessment. You can do a CSF security and privacy assessment. You can do a CSF comprehensive security assessment, which is obviously from the name comprehensive and much more inclusive of many of these requirements. Then you have a CSF comprehensive security and privacy assessment. So that's going to include those privacy domains in addition to the security for the comprehensiveness. And then you can do a NIST cybersecurity assessment. But regardless of what you choose, you have an option here. You can do a self-assessment process, which is by which your organization can look at what those requirements are based on the scope. And you can use whatever resources that you have internally and with a consulting group, such as like Ostendio, to actually go in and just make sure that you're doing what you need to do, you're meeting these requirements, and more importantly, where there are shortcomings, you have the technology and the team to get behind making this happen. And there's a process there for organizations that have never stepped through this before. This is a day-to-day, an overall governance type of structure that needs to be taken into consideration. It is certainly not a check-the-box type of thing. These are best practice standards that need to be implemented from people, process, and technology in all aspects. So many organizations, especially ones that are a little bit more limited in resources, need to call upon experts in this area to really get their hands dirty and to help them create these policies, implement these technologies, and really carry them, down to the end zone. So that's basically what we're looking at here. Is through the self-assessment process. This is really the organization doing their own assessment and measuring up what they need to for purposes of what their overall objective is. The next phase of that, or a phase that you could take and go directly. Now, I will add that the recommended approach by HITRUST and most assessors is going to be that an organization does go through the self-assessment process first, just to make sure that they're in a good position for the validated assessment. The validated assessment is really when you engage an assessing firm like Cherry Bekaert to basically review your object or the scope of what you're submitting for purposes of your assessment. And we will do the testing required in order to make sure that what you present in the way of design and disclosure of the controls is representative of what you have and it's appropriate to meet the criteria. So from that perspective, that becomes the highest level of assurance in many cases. We as a CPA firm do this under what we call our attest standards, which is what many of our audit standards such as SOC and other third-party reporting engagements fall into. And these are particularly predicated based on strict rules of independence and other types of reporting requirements and quality control requirements that are needed in order to make sure that these engagements are at the level of expectation, both with HITRUST and, in our case, AICPA standards. So a validated assessment is, again, HITRUST validating the work done by the assessor, and you would receive a validated report. If the report that you submit, it meets the appropriate level for certification, then you would be getting what's called a certified report, CSF certified report. And there's a bit of a difference there, but I will certainly talk to that in the next slide here. So again, as we look at these reports, we have this self-assessment. It's typically something that's more affordable. You're not paying a third-party assessor to do. You can, depending on the maturity of your organization, you can quickly get through it. But you can also provide it as a stepping stone. We typically talk to organizations, whether they're deciding to go with a validated assessment or not. It's a great stepping stone just to kind of overall benchmark where you are. With the CSF validated, as I stated earlier, it's going to require on-site testing. It's going to require an independent third-party assessor in order to issue that validated report. And HITRUST obviously receives that and validates that it's done according to their expectation. If a report is submitted and the organization has not scored high enough for certification, but yet everything is as expected for the level of attest and audit that's done, that is typically when you get the validated report. If you do achieve the expectation of a rating of 3+ or 3 with caps, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, then you could get a CSF certification. Again, the certification is required requires an independent third party or an independent assessor approved by HITRUST. As Cherry Bekaert is, there's a minimum rating of 3+ for all domains based on a PRISMA score. And each of these scores, if you do score less than a 3+, if you get a 3, then there's an expectation of what's called a cap. And that's really a corrective action plan. So think of it as 3+ is the certification score for a maturity rating, and 3 with caps for those that fall short could still potentially get you your certified report. So that's kind of the difference between those. Again, before I move on, keep in mind that CSF validated and CSF certified, very important that the assessor is independent for those particular assessments. They're independent of the implementation of the controls or implementation, they're independent of the scoring of the controls, and they're there particularly to do this attest or assessment piece. Next slide, please. So let's kind of sum this up a little bit and think about, as it pertains to scope, things to remember here. We're certainly going to take into account the level of maturity when we're looking at our report. We may not want to just jump right into certification if we think that our maturity level can't sustain that. It's definitely a good idea to involve your third-party assessor early in the process. Assessors can do what's called a gap assessment, where they can work with you to see where you are and kind of let you know what those expectations are and identify gaps and still remain independent. Where the concern would be is if the assessor is actually writing policies and procedures and implementing controls that they're later going to attest to. That's a clear violation of independence there. And you also want to choose your high trust preparer and assessor carefully. You certainly want to make sure that this is not a check the box audit. You want to make sure there's a value add there and that the organization has certainly taken into account the expectation and the experience needed in order to get through what they need to. Next slide, please. So with version 9, the lowest number of controls that need to be assessed is 75, an increase from 66 from version 8. And the scoring metrics are not compliant, somewhat compliant, partially compliant, mostly compliant, and fully compliant. So as we go through each one of these particular components, this is really what the assessor would be looking to rate these controls based on how mature they are. Next slide, please. So for certification, once again, we're looking at this 75, and the scoring level needs to be the equivalent of what we would call implemented. And I'll kind of back up and shed some light on that. There's a 5 Prisma-based scoring system for the security levels. There's 0%, which obviously you didn't meet it. There's 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100% as a representation of how you would score that level. Within that, there's policy, process, implemented, measured, and managed, right? So over those 5 different areas, again, I'll say that again, policy, which is 25% of the score of that particular requirement, 25% is process, 25% is implemented, 15% is measured, and 10% is managed, making up 100%. So when we say that we're looking at a level of compliance of the equivalent to implemented, we're really talking about 75%, which would include the first 3 of what I had mentioned. That's policy, process, and implemented. You do see organizations that will gain additional credit for scoring and measured and managed, but these are typically organizations where these controls are a bit more mature and they have the ability to allocate resources to measure and manage the particular controls that they're looking to accomplish that objective with. So the baseline expectation for a control for passing there is 75%, meaning there's a clearly defined formal policy, there's a clearly defined formal process by which they actually have the control defined and implemented, and then the full implementation of the control is again that other 25% making up the 75%. So that's how that kind of pans out for certification. And then again, just reinforcing that the number of controls is certainly not standardized. You can take companies that are even relatively similar, but based on these different factors and scoping factors, it could be different and the amount of controls could be different. Next slide, please. So this slide here is just getting back to what we alluded to a little bit earlier. What's the role of the preparer? So the organization's management is going to be responsible for really understanding and defining the scope, performing the self-assessment. And as with any type of governance program, they need to look left and right and understand, do we have the resources internally, or do we need to hire a subject matter expert to help us get there? And in cases like that, especially for less mature or smaller organizations who are new to the process, they may lean on a security consulting group, such as Ostendio, to actually come out and help them really navigate through this process. And again, because there's no independence requirement for that consultant, they can get as technically involved in the implementation and design as they wish and as they need to meet those requirements. That's really the role of the preparer. So they can help in that self-assessment process. They can help the organization and management ultimately score. Or again, if management has a team that's got the experience to do this, they can certainly go through and do the preparation and do the scoring themselves. They can make sure that the implementation of the controls is at a level of expectation. Supporting documentation is mature enough to substantiate it. And they can also look at remediation and corrective actions that need to be performed, again, amongst their team or with a subject matter expert. That's really the role of the preparer. Next slide, please. The next slide talks to the role of the assessor, and that's the third-party assessing firm that's going to help the client adopt the HITRUST CSF. And the role of the assessor is to perform the HITRUST CSF assessment. Again, understanding that there could be a process by which the assessor does, in some cases, called a readiness assessment, but it really is more of a gap assessment, where the assessor is just saying that you may or may not have met a particular area and that they need to perform some additional work around meeting the various components and requirements of that particular control. But again, they're not necessarily getting in and doing it for them, or obviously not scoring it for them. So they are performing the CSF assessment. They could be performing SOC 2 engagements, leveraging the CSF control framework. So that's something you typically see. Cherry Beckert, obviously being a CPA firm and also specializing in SOC 2 delivery, we get involved in those mappings and understanding the differences between and complexities between the two engagements and trying to synergize that for our customers from the attest component side of it and the assessment side. And then, of course, understanding the corrective action plan is going to be based on these CFS assessments. So it's important for the assessor to understand what that corrective action plan is while maintaining their independence, and also reporting that appropriately to justify the scores if there is a 3+ cap for a particular domain. Next slide, please. So again, just a couple of things to consider here. Consider engaging that expert support early in the process. It's certainly better to understand what those requirements are when you're putting up the foundation than to find out, once you're actually painting the walls, that you did need something in order to keep the structure alive. So engaging an expert early on in various components is certainly recommended. And again, we've said it a few times here, but keeping in line the independence is something that is certainly beneficial, and in many cases, obviously for attest delivery, is a requirement for any type of attest engagement, HITRUST or SOC related. So one of the last things that we're going to do here is we're going to report and remediate. So we've addressed gaps in implementation. We've gone through and we've done our testing as an assessor, and we're good with everything that we found. Where there are potential gaps, we've identified what those corrective action plans were, and that there's a path to remediation. And again, this whole process is going to vary based on the organization's level of support and what needs to be accomplished there. Next slide, please. Some things to think about. So when the assessor obtains access to the object to perform the validated assessment or the certification, from the time that they submit it to HITRUST for purposes of the actual scoring or the validation from HITRUST, their work has to be performed within 90 days of that submission to HITRUST. Then once that object has been submitted to HITRUST, HITRUST does what they need to do for purposes of validating and making sure that either you get a validated report or you get a certified report if you're meeting the objectives. They typically have, once they release that that report, you have 30 days to make some initial draft to some of the cosmetic modifications of the report. There's certain things that you can change. There's other things that are locked down and you cannot change. And just to reiterate here, for certification, an organization must achieve at least 3+ for domain scores or 3 with caps. And in order to be a properly identified corrective action plan, you have to identify who is responsible for the corrections, who's the owner, what's the anticipated date of remediation, what the corrective action plan is, and of course the current status, if it's started, if it's in progress. And when we look at these are on a domain level. And if you recall from earlier conversations, based on version 8, there are 19 domains that made up this, the particular type of framework here. So let's talk, this is just an example execution plan. There's going to be different sub-variants of this depending on the organization. But an organization may start to put the feeler out to say, hey, we're understanding the importance of HITRUST and we're starting to gain momentum here in our organization, and there's been a lot of increase for it. So let's talk a little bit about what we need to do in the way of resources and kind of coming up with familiarity with the framework and the subject matter, and really defining what those resources are going to be, and maybe a methodology and approach. Once they've done kind of their reconnaissance and their understanding of all of this, they're going to go and obtain access to the MyCSF tool and go through the formal scoping process there, where they actually are going to fill out all of those factors that we talked about before. That's going to give them, in essence, a snapshot of what they're going to need to do based on that current version, and what requirements they're going to need to adhere to in order to get, to conduct their self-assessment. They then go through the typical process. They then go through the process of doing the self-assessment. They use the resources that they have to go through and properly identify what controls they have. They implement controls they don't have. They formalize controls that in many small organizations or less mature are informal, to really make sure that they're achieving that minimum 75 benchmark score. Around this process is a good time, if you haven't already, to identify that approved assessor, someone who you feel you could speak with and kind of help you navigate some of the questions that you might have, so when the time comes to submit your object or what you're going to have for purposes of your engagement submitted over to the assessor. That's basically what you're going to be doing when you identify that assessor and get that assistance. Once you've done that, you'll submit your object for a validated assessment or certification. So the assessor will receive the object within the tool, they'll get access to it, and then again, they'll conduct their assessment, and all of their work would need to be performed within 90 days of the time that they submit that object back to HITRUST for validation or certification. And then, of course, through that process, they'd also be finalizing any required corrective action plans in the draft report. So the report comes back, HITRUST gives them a period of time to address any required caps in the draft reporting process, and then a final report, either validated or certified, would be issued, provided that everything was met. That's a little bit of, again, an example execution. Next slide, please. So a couple of things to remember. The HITRUST certification is valid for 2 years. However, there is an interim assessment or an interim review that's typically done after 12 months. And this is something that needs to be done at that 1 year mark or before that 1 year mark. And the assessor would basically take a look at the environment, and they would perform limited testing across each domain in order to validate that there hasn't been any material change, that controls are still where they expect to be. They'll do a sampling methodology to make sure that they're comfortable. They'll make sure that any caps that the management team has presented have been formally acted upon, and that it's not, something that is just kind of died out. So those are the typical things that you'd see in that 1 year mark. If there's a substantial change and the company undergoes whatever it is for purposes of a material change to the environment, or a change of ownership by acquisition or merger or something along those lines, then there could be the possibility that you do have to go through and resubmit and redo what you're looking at there. So there are a couple of things to keep in mind as you go through this process. So many of you have probably heard of SOC 2, which is System Organization and Controls, used to be Service Organization Control Reporting. which is built on the trust service principles and criteria, which I've always kind of alluded to the fact that the trust service principles and criteria was the AICPA's best kept secret. These principles and criteria have evolved over time, but I believe they originated sometime in the early 2000s. So basically, a SOC 2 report is a attest report that's based on the SSAE 18 standard, but it's really on the reporting over operations and compliance related to the following principles. You have the security criteria, you have availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. Those are typically the quadrant, or each of the criteria marks that you may be looking upon. So some organizations may look to get, kind of dip their toe in and just go for security, while others may be a little bit more aggressive and start to look at that availability, processing integrity, and confidentiality, and privacy, and so forth. It's important to note that the HITRUST CSF tool does a good job of identifying relevant controls that can assist you through some of these principles and criteria, so that if you are doing both, you kind of have a bit of a roadmap there. And again, that's going to vary from organization to organization. Another thing to think about too is that there's, like everything else with these frameworks, there's an evolution. And SOC for Cyber, reporting on a management's description of their cybersecurity assessment program, or cybersecurity program, is something that's new this year, or last year, 2017. So you'll start to see some words there for SOC for Cyber, and also coming soon, SOC for Supply Chain Management. These firms, these reports typically include an opinion, management assertion, a system description, the description of controls and the test of results, and then some other information. When it comes to getting the integration of a SOC 2 report with a HITRUST report, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. An organization could do the HITRUST certification on its own. They could do a SOC 2 report on its own, type 1 or type 2, type 2 being operating effectiveness. SOC 2, you could do a SOC 2 plus a HITRUST CSF, which is a SOC 2 plus report. So in other words, they're doing a SOC 2, but the AICPA firm is basically reporting on not only the trust service principles and criteria, but also the HITRUST criteria. In order for a CPA firm to do this, they do have to purchase a subscription with HITRUST in order to carry out that report. Another option would be for the organization to get a SOC 2 plus HITRUST CSF plus a certification. So this is basically a SOC 2 report, a SOC 2 plus report on the SOC criteria, the appropriate SOC criteria, in addition to the HITRUST CSF appropriate certification criteria, and also, actually I should say the comprehensive criteria, and also the certification criteria for what's required by HITRUST. In order for a firm to do this, they need to be an approved assessor, a CPA firm and an approved assessor by HITRUST. And just that one other point that I did kind of touch upon here is these SOC reports, there's a type 1 and a type 2, and a type 1 is a design type of audit. It's on the accuracy of the description, and it's also on the suitability of the design of the controls to meet the criteria. And a type 2 is everything the type 1 is plus operating effectiveness. Some of the benefits that you do get with having the SOC 2 and the HITRUST is that you're definitely leveraging your savings of time, cost, and you're gaining efficiencies. And it's obviously going to increase your client satisfaction if you have organizations and third-party requirements that are asking for both. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grant to kind of talk a little bit about some of the challenges.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for that overview. That was great detail. So again, conducting any form of compliance program is not necessarily easy for an organization. Especially something like HITRUST, which is obviously very detailed. I often come across organizations who hear about HITRUST and say, oh, it wouldn't be interested to do because we can tell our customers we have it. But really, typically, it's going to be something you're going to do if you have to do it. Most businesses have got a lot of enough in their mind to try and sell the product, grow their business, etc. But there's no doubt that especially in healthcare, as we talked earlier on, if you're selling into some of the major payers, providers, But really, at the end of the day, it's going to become a cost of sale, because you're not going to be able to make the sale unless you can actually demonstrate to them that you can be trusted, and HITRUST becomes their kind of framework of choice. Just to get an idea of kind of cost, because you can typically go through a HIPAA assessment for about $10,000–$15,000, maybe more, depending on the size of the organization. But if you do decide that you're going to go through the HITRUST process, there are a number of direct costs, and these are examples rather than specific. Again, you should go and get your own quotes. But fundamentally, I mean, the self-assessment report is going to be $2,500. The validated assessment per submission between $37 and $7,500, depending on the size of your organization. Again, you're going to have to typically maintain an annual subscription to the MyCSF platform that HITRUST provide. You can take just report-only access, but increasingly, as you go through this process, you're going to find that kind of prohibits or limits you to some degree. So more and more customers are taking annual subscription. And then obviously, as we've talked about, the assessor fees themselves through someone like Cherry Becker are going to vary, and we've seen them vary from at the lowest end $20,000 up to as high as $175,000 for some of the prestige organizations. So again, it does bode well to shop around, or at least know you're dealing with a trusted provider, and I'd also actually ironically be wary of any who provide the fee is too cheap. So you're really talking about, just in terms of direct cost, between $40,000 and $60,000, and that doesn't include your internal operational costs. So again, you're probably going to have to invest more on your back-end infrastructure. You're probably going to have to invest more in your log management capabilities, encryption capabilities, etc. As you go through some of these requirements, you're going to have to spend time and cost on individual third-party tools to improve your overall operation. And that doesn't obviously take into account even the amount of time that your employees are going to have to spend on this, and clearly the lost opportunity. But again, if you're in an organization, you're in an industry where your customers are saying to you they're not going to buy from you unless you're going to be HITRUST certified, then you really don't have a choice. And it's not often we see small organizations going through this, but if they're in this industry, they have to. And when we talk about the pros and cons, we'll talk about some of the things that HITRUST are trying to do to address that. Next slide, please. So again, a few other things as well. Like any compliance program, they're documentation heavy. I speak to a lot of clients who spend a lot of time saying that they do a lot of the right things, and most organizations set out trying to do the right things. But fundamentally, this is about providing evidence. And if you can't provide evidence that it's been done, if you can't provide documentation or logs or some sort of evidence that you've done it, then your auditor's not going to give you credit for you, because this is not about trust per se. This is about making sure that they can demonstrate and they can track all that. And then, the validated process, when you actually submit, you don't submit the validation assessment with a view of getting a score and then coming back. Again, once it's finally submitted, after you've submitted corrective actions, as Steve mentioned earlier on, that's it. That's your assessment submitted. Your score is what you score. If you get a high enough score, then you can move through to the certified component. If you don't, then you're going to stay with a validated report. But that's it, done. If you then want to go through this process again, you have to start from the beginning again. Hopefully, obviously, operationally, you've already made those investments, so it becomes simpler. And then again, organizationally, it really is, again, important that organizationally the company embraces this. This really has to be from the CEO and probably even the board down to the organization, a culture, because everyone's going to be involved and everyone's going to be affected by this program. So this is, again, one of the biggest challenges typically with security and compliance within organizations is sometimes it can be segmented into the department of the security department or the compliance officer. Again, HITRUST is very difficult to do that. You really have to get broad approval. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, if you're trying to make the decision whether HITRUST is appropriate to you, I mean, some of the reasons why you might do this, again, it is generally accepted by most healthcare organizations today. So, again, if you go and you basically say that you're HITRUST certified, that's going to really give you a huge leg up in terms of dealing with some of the major providers. Now, I will warn you that it's not a panacea. You're still going to have to probably fill out some of those questionnaires. But because your organization is at the position where you've met the HITRUST certification level, you know that for the most part, you're going to be able to answer those questions as simply and easily, because again, HITRUST is going to ensure that operationally you're doing the right thing. There's much clearer definitions versus some other frameworks in terms of what specifically you need to do, which in many cases makes it easier for you to abide by that specific requirement. And it actually defines a minimum level. It tells you that some of the other frameworks, as I mentioned, allow you more flexibility to determine the level of risk and how you mitigate the risk. HITRUST is much more prescriptive, again, which some people like, both in terms of going through it as well as assessing people. And as I think Steve has mentioned, we've seen in previous slides, once you've gone through HITRUST, it really is, I mean, one of the things that MyCSF does really, really well is this crosswalk between HITRUST and many other frameworks. So you can actually see specifically how, based on the different domains, the different controls, how they list to NIST 800, 171, or how they list to HIPAA, or how they specifically align with ISO 27001, etc. On the negative side, again, it really is an expensive process, which again, for larger organizations as a cost of sale may be justifiable. For smaller organizations, again, it's a much bigger ask. And I know HITRUST are working on launching very shortly, kind of HITRUST for smaller businesses, which will hopefully streamline the process and make it a little bit more cost effective for those businesses. And I know that's based on feedback they've received. But this is not something that you do just because you want to do it. We see a lot of misinterpretation of separation between preparation and audit. You saw, or you heard Steve talk a lot about the fact that the assessor and the preparer should be independent. And if you come across a HITRUST assessor who's basically getting more involved in the preparation, that should be a red flag for you, because fundamentally you need them to be independent. And they can obviously provide you, gap information, they can give you advice and guidance generally, but they should not be offering you a proposal and it says that they'll help to develop policies, develop procedures, help build and implement your operational process, because then effectively they're auditing themselves, and that kind of breaks that governance model. And I know that HITRUST obviously kind of want to make sure that their auditors are independent as well. The flip side to the clearer definitions and minimal level of compliance is that sometimes HITRUST can be seen to be too rigid. Obviously, when you create any framework, trying to be applicable to the huge variation of organizations out there. And so there has been criticism sometimes that maybe there might be a particular standard or requirement that isn't applicable to that particular type of business, yet you have to still go through it. And so I know that HITRUST are continuing to work on that sort of feedback. And then just, again, the time that it takes to go through the HITRUST process, obviously, through the self-assessment, the verification process, and the HITRUST certification process. I know HITRUST obviously provide the timeline and try and make it as efficient, as effective as possible. But at the end of the day, it still is a long process. And typically speaking, it's more, it's usual for an organization from beginning to process to take about 18 months to actually go through the whole process. It clearly is possible to do it faster, but in my experience, that's the exception rather than the rule. So make sure you plan sufficient time to do this. Do not expect to start the HITRUST process and within 3 months you're going to be done, because I think it's going to be very difficult for you to prioritize, implement, and deal with things you need to do, unless you really are already at that level of maturity as an organization where you really think it's more just a process you're following rather than any fundamental changes operationally. Steve.
Thank you, Grant. So why Cherry Bekaert? Cherry Bekaert is a top 25 CPA firm, and we have a specialty practice, particularly in our RAS service line offering, that has offered decades of experience related to the current standard around service organization control reporting, because that's evolved over time, cybersecurity, InfoSec, HIPAA, HITRUST, and in addition to many other third-party reporting requirements based on risk management and technology risk management. We also have a significant experience in an array of industries, but very much within the healthcare and the technology and health industries as well. Our team is composed of not only governance and IT audit professionals, but our team has very technical experience down to, from the cybersecurity perspective, all the way down to pen testing, incident response, and things of that nature. So we pride ourselves in the fact that based on our experience from small to large companies, we can certainly get in and understand what those expectations are to meet requirements across these different types of regulatory requirements and other types of third-party requirements, and address it in such a way where we're not expecting, a Fortune 500 company level of framework implementation at a 30-person shop. So we certainly bring that level of experience, and we provide that in a value-added way. So I guess that's where I would tell you why I think Cherry Bekaert would be a good choice.
Great, Stephen. So just a quick overview. Ostendio, again, we provide, as Steve mentioned, a lot of the preparation services to help organizations build and develop their security programs. And we do this predominantly using a platform we've developed called MyVCM. And what MyVCM does is it basically allows you to automate a lot of the tasks involved in maintaining a security program. Particularly, if you're looking to implement something like the HITRUST framework, as we've talked about, depending on the number of domains and controls that you have to operationalize, you really don't want to be tracking all that in spreadsheets. So the MyVCM platform allows you to not only store and manage your documentation, as we talked about, make sure that all your processes are automated through the workflow engine that we have. We can demonstrate through the platform that you're actually implementing those controls as required, as well as because the reports aligned with the specific domain and controls allow you to demonstrate you're measuring compliance overall to the HITRUST framework. And that allows you to demonstrate, again, effectively that you're managing all the elements of the program. So again, what we're trying to do through MyVCM is making this process, which at the end of the day is quite a heavy lift. We're trying to make it as simple, efficient, and effective as possible. To audit it, we use this concept of always audit ready. So the idea is that when you're ready to go through the certification process with HITRUST, through the validation process, you have all the information on a day-to-day basis through our platform, which is basically operated by everyone within the organization as well. So again, that's what's going to allow you to be demonstrate you're ready, that you're on time, and particularly not just the first time, but when you're going through the interim assessment and then you're going through the reassessment in 24 months' time. Our platform will allow you to stay current and will actually allow you to maintain and keep all the operational workflows that you have to do up to date and in place, rather than you having to kind of go through this boom and bust approach where all of a sudden you have to sort of jump through hoops again to get ready. So that's really kind of why Ostendio is MyVCM, based on our experience doing this for small and large organizations, and the fact that the platform automates much of the process to make it a lot lighter and easier for you.
Great. So I want to say thank you to our two presenters. They did a great job. I know we're nearly out of time, but we have time for a couple of quick questions. So I'm going to direct this one to Grant. So we have a question from Victor who asks, if we're not handling any records, are we exempt from HITRUST?
So again, HITRUST, as we mentioned earlier on, is not specific to a particular regulation, but obviously it builds on regulations like the HIPAA. So HIPAA itself talks specifically about a particular type of data called protected health information. And protected health information is basically healthcare information that you're handling on behalf of what they call a covered entity. So that can be a provider, a health plan, or a clearinghouse, or someone involved in the treatment of care. In that case, HIPAA applies. HITRUST can actually be applied much more broadly than that. So really, if you have any type of secure information at all, HITRUST is just a security framework, again, built around HIPAA, but you can use it for any reason. So when you talk about a record, I mean, again, it really comes down to what is that record you're referring to. If that record meets the specification or the definition of protected health information, then you certainly are obligated to be compliant with HIPAA, and then HITRUST may be a way for you to make that. With regards to outside of PHI, most of the time that comes down to your customer. What are your customers demanding, and what are the basic interested stakeholders demanding? If they're demanding that you secure your organization in alignment with something like HITRUST or SOC 2, then if you want their business, that's typically what you do.
Great, thank you, Grant. And we have time for one more question, which I'm going to direct to you, Steve. So Lester asks, are controls assessed based on a point in time, controls in place at the time of assessment, or based on whether the control has been in place over a period of time, i.e. 1 year? For example, records for approval of access are in place for 1 month prior to the assessment.
So I think that's a super question. And for me to give kind of a good representation of and examples for that, I'm going to compare HITRUST with SOC. For a SOC 2, if you were doing a SOC 2 type 1, which is really around the accuracy of a system's design and the accuracy of the system description and the suitability of the design around the criteria, it's really a point in time assessment for a SOC 2 type 1. When you look at a SOC 2 type 2, it's around the operating effectiveness, which typically is a minimum of a 6-month period, but also, you know, typically you see it go for an annual period. So if you're doing a type 2, you'd expect to see these controls in place throughout the control period. And it is a historical based report. So it's based on the operation and implementation of these controls over the period covered within the scope. Now, with a high trust assessment, the high trust assessment is actually, if you look at it from a design perspective, making sure that all the controls are designed to meet the objectives and they're implemented and they're meeting all the expectations within the parameters that we discussed. However, the thought process is it's really a forward-looking report. So in other words, we're doing a design attest, but we're thinking about what impact that has going forward. Hence, then you do a one-year renewal and then you do it again in the second year. However, when you're actually doing your design-based work or you're doing your assessment, you are looking at evidence that can go back as far as a year in order to make sure that you feel comfortable that the control is implemented the way it's expected to be implemented. So it is something where if you had a control in and it was in for a month, provided that it met all the requirements and it was time to do the attest, then that would be something, provided that it was done properly and that it is forward-looking to be sustainable going forward. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. And unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. So any questions that we didn't get answered, I will reach out to you personally and make sure that you get a response. So I just want to say thank you for joining us today for a HITRUST webinar. If you'd like to contact either Grant or Steve to learn more about HITRUST preparation and auditing, then please feel free to reach out. Their contact information is on the screen. I will be sending the recording out to you tomorrow, and thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day.